Hi, it's a pleasure to have you here. Subscribe to the channel and comment which city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My husband, Mark, walked into the house with that same crooked smile he always wore when he was hiding something. But this time there was an envelope in his hand. He kissed me on the cheek like nothing was wrong, then sat beside me and said he'd been watching me lately, noticing how tired I looked, how the stress was starting to steal my light. His voice was calm, sweet even, and I almost believed the sudden concern, until he handed me 2 cruise tickets to the Caribbean and said, "You need to rest, babe, really rest." I felt a lump rise in my throat, a strange mix of surprise and guilt twisting in my chest as I hugged him, tears filling my eyes, thanking him for being so thoughtful. At that moment, I didn't see the lie behind his eyes, only the man I thought still loved me. I asked him, almost whispering, why he wasn't coming with me, expecting some half-hearted plan to join later, but his answer came too quickly, too rehearsed. "Work's a mess, I can't get time off, you know how it is." He smiled as he touched my hand and said, "Go alone, honey, you deserve it," like he was granting me a gift instead of pushing me away. I wanted to question it, but his tone was warm, and for a moment I believed he just wanted to do something kind. Maybe he really thought I needed time alone. Maybe he was trying to save what we had. So I nodded, still clinging to the illusion that love was what motivated him. I spent the next day walking through department stores, buying swimsuits, sunscreen, a new pair of sunglasses, trying to feel excited, trying to imagine peace. I told Mark I'd be gone for hours, wanted the surprise of seeing his face when I showed him everything I bought. But halfway through my errands, I felt this strange pull, a tightness in my chest I couldn't explain, and I decided to go home early. I expected to find him on the couch, maybe working, maybe sleeping. I never imagined that crossing the threshold of our house would split my life in two. I pushed the door open quietly, shopping bags in hand, and stepped into the soft silence of the house. The living room light was on, and I heard Mark's voice, low at first, then louder. Not talking to me, not on a work call, but laughing, relaxed, speaking in a tone I hadn't heard in months. I froze behind the hallway wall, the sound of his laughter cutting into me like ice, sharp and wrong. My pulse quickened as I moved closer, hearing a name I didn't recognize, hearing affection in his voice that hadn't been mine in a long time. My heart already knew the truth before my ears caught up. I stood still, not breathing, as his voice turned darker, colder, and suddenly deadly serious. "The cruise is one way," he said, his tone shifting from playful to deliberate, like he was explaining a plan he'd gone over 100 times. "Finally, we'll get rid of her." He laughed again, the kind of laugh people only give when they feel untouchable. My stomach dropped so fast I thought I would faint, and my entire body went cold. In one sentence, the man I had trusted with my life became a stranger I couldn't recognize. I backed away slowly, quietly, hands trembling, bags slipping from my arms, heart thundering so hard I thought it would give me away. My thoughts scattered in all directions. Was he joking? Was this some cruel misunderstanding? But no, his voice had been too steady, too certain. My vision blurred as I realized there was nothing left to question. Mark had a mistress, and together they wanted me gone. And worse than the betrayal was the clarity. I had been sleeping beside a man capable of destroying me. I waited in the hallway for the call to end, wiping my face and forcing my breath to slow, practicing a smile I didn't feel. When I stepped into the living room, he looked up like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just signed my death sentence with another woman. I showed him the bags, talked about my shopping, even laughed at one of his jokes, while inside I was choking on every word. He had no idea I knew, and I planned to keep it that way for now. I barely slept that night. I stared at the ceiling while Mark snored beside me, unaware that every breath he took made my skin crawl. The pieces of our marriage, the lies, the sudden mood swings, the late nights, all rearranged themselves into something I couldn't ignore anymore. I saw it all clearly now. Every detail that once seemed small was part of a calculated move. He hadn't fallen out of love. He had orchestrated my end, and I wasn't going to let it happen. By the time the sun crept through the blinds, I had made up my mind. I wouldn't run. I wouldn't cry. I would survive this, and I would make sure Mark regretted every second of his plan. I would pretend to fall for his lies just a little longer, just enough to buy myself time. He wanted to get rid of me on a cruise? Fine. Let the cruise begin, but on my terms. That morning, while Mark was still in the shower, I dressed calmly and left for the bank with a practiced smile and a calm voice. I told them I was closing our joint account, transferring the entire balance to a private one under my name. There were no questions, just signatures and numbers on a screen. I walked out of there with every dollar we had built together, every cent he thought he controlled. Mark didn't know it yet, but the game had already changed. The next morning, Mark helped me with my suitcase, his hand cold on my back as he kissed me goodbye on the sidewalk. I looked up at him, pretending to be the same woman who had cried over cruise tickets, who had once trusted every word from his mouth. I smiled sweetly, thanked him again, and got into the cab with all the grace I could muster. He waved, turned, and walked away without looking back. And that was the last time I saw him with blind love in my eyes. As the ship pulled away from the port in Miami, I stood at the railing with the sun warming my face, the ocean stretching wide and endless in front of me. I wasn't smiling because I was free, not yet, but because I had survived the moment I thought would break me. I looked around at the other passengers laughing, drinking, taking selfies, while I held on to a truth too heavy for words. Mark thought I was sailing into a trap, but he had no idea I had already escaped it. And as the shore disappeared behind us, I made myself a silent vow. I would never let anyone steal my power again. 10 minutes after the ship left the dock, Mark was back in New York, trying to buy something expensive online, probably for her. I imagined his face twitching when the card declined, once, then again, until he had to call the bank in confusion. I pictured the silence on the other end when they told him the funds were gone, the account closed, nothing left. He probably checked the numbers twice, 3 times, trying to figure out what had happened. But I was already far out at sea, unreachable, untouchable. I didn't see it, but I could almost feel it. The rage in his voice, the disbelief turning into panic when he realized I'd beaten him at his own game. He must have called the bank manager, shouted, demanded explanations, but it wouldn't matter. The money was legally mine now, and there was no one to blame but himself. I smiled, not because of revenge, but because I had taken back control without screaming, without begging. In silence, I had turned the knife he gave me into my shield. Mark called me over and over, but the cruise ship had already left any reachable signal, and I made sure my phone was off anyway. Every unanswered call would be a reminder that he wasn't in control anymore, that I was no longer playing his game. I imagined him pacing, texting, spiraling, his carefully crafted plan unraveling like thread pulled loose. He thought I was clueless, that I'd walk right into whatever trap he'd set. But instead, I had vanished, leaving him with silence and consequences. With no access to money and no story that made sense, his mistress must have seen the cracks fast. I don't know how long she waited, a day, maybe less, before she stopped answering too. She wanted a man who could provide, who could destroy his wife and walk away rich. But Mark had nothing now, not even a plan, and certainly not a future with her. She left him just as coldly as he planned to leave me. He didn't see it then, but it was justice wrapped in irony. One night on the deck, wrapped in a shawl under the stars, I let myself cry. Not for him, but for all the years I had given to someone who never saw me. I let the ocean wind carry away every silent moment, every buried fear, every apology I had forced myself to make to keep him happy. I wasn't broken, I was raw, exposed, finally real. I stood there for hours, not thinking, not planning, just being. And in that stillness, I began to feel whole again. Slowly, I let myself enjoy the cruise, the music at sunset, the laughter of strangers, the taste of tropical drinks I'd never bothered to try before. I danced barefoot on the deck one night, laughed with a group of women I'd just met, And for the first time in years, I didn't feel watched or judged. No one knew my story, and that was beautiful. I was just me, not someone's wife, not someone's target. The betrayal still hurt, but it didn't define me. I was alive, and that was enough. I had booked a return flight before the cruise even began, paid in cash from my new account, and stored the ticket safely in my suitcase. I wasn't sailing away forever. I was coming back on my terms, on my timeline. Mark couldn't track me, couldn't stop me, and most importantly, couldn't fool me again. Every move I made now was mine alone, with no fear behind it. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting, I was deciding. When I stepped off the plane in New York, the air felt colder, heavier. But I walked with steady feet and my head high. Mark was there at arrivals, waiting, face twisted with fake concern and barely hidden rage. He opened his mouth to speak, ready to spin whatever story he'd prepared. But I didn't slow down. I didn't cry or scream. I just looked him in the eye, knowing exactly what came next. He had expected a broken wife. What he got was a woman rebuilt in fire. We didn't go home. I led him to a nearby cafe, public and quiet, where I sat across from him and let him talk first. He stumbled through half-truths, excuses, weak jokes, trying to regain control with the charm that once fooled me. But I said nothing until he ran out of air. Then I leaned forward, steady and cold, and simply said, "I know everything. I heard your call." His face went blank, like someone pulled the floor out from under him. And that was when I saw it, fear. I didn't raise my voice, didn't cry, didn't shake. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "I know everything. I heard your call. Thanks for the cruise, I loved it. Now I'm divorcing you." His mouth opened, but no sound came. For once, the man who always had a comeback, a manipulation, a backup lie, was completely speechless, and I savored every second of it. He blinked slowly, trying to process my words, but I saw it. The mask slipping, the panic rising behind his eyes. He looked smaller somehow, like a child caught in a lie that's finally too big to manage. The silence between us felt like justice. I stood up, grabbed my bag, and left him there, frozen in his own shame. That moment, that expression would stay with me forever. The exact second he realized I was no longer his victim. I filed for divorce that same week. No hesitation, no discussion. My lawyer was precise and efficient. We went after everything I was entitled to, and not a cent less. In court, Mark looked like a shadow of himself, trying to plead, trying to twist the narrative, but the judge saw through him like glass. Our assets were split evenly, but I walked out with so much more than money. I walked out whole. News of the divorce and the truth about what he tried to do spread fast. Friends distanced themselves, and his mistress vanished completely. He called, emailed, even sent flowers, but no one replied. He tried to save face, but there was no one left to impress, no one who believed a word he said. I didn't celebrate his downfall. I simply moved forward while he stood alone, watching everything he built slip through his fingers. I started over slowly but deliberately. I used my share of the settlement to rent a small place and find a job I actually cared about, something that didn't drain the life out of me. Every morning, I woke up without fear, without second-guessing myself, and that freedom felt better than anything money could buy. I no longer lived in reaction to someone else's moods. I was building something that was finally mine. I moved into a cozy apartment in Brooklyn. Nothing extravagant, just warm, clean, and quiet. It had plants on the windowsill, soft pillows on the couch, and shelves I could fill with whatever made me feel alive. There was no one checking what I wore, no one judging what I spent, no cold silence in the mornings. Just peace. And for the first time in years, that was enough. I signed up for a gym, booked my first therapy session, and bought a stack of books I'd always wanted to read. I started treating my body like it mattered, not like something I had to hide or shrink. Some days were harder than others, but each small act was a quiet rebellion against the woman I used to be. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was healing, and that process became sacred to me. Slowly, I let my friends back in, the real ones, the ones Mark always found ways to keep distant. They didn't judge me. They just showed up with food, laughter, and reminders that I had survived something enormous. We spent long nights talking, crying, and laughing until we were breathless. I realized I was never truly alone. I had simply been cut off from the love I needed most. Now I was surrounded by it. Months later, I met David at a bookstore. Not through a dating app, not through forced conversation, just a shared moment over a novel we both loved. He was kind, not in a showy way, but in the quiet way that makes you feel safe. He listened when I spoke, didn't flinch at my past, and never once made me feel small. I didn't plan to fall for him. I was still learning how to breathe again. But he was gentle and I didn't want to run. Letting David in wasn't easy. I had walls, reflexes, doubts that shouted louder than logic. But he never pushed, never demanded. He showed up consistently with patience I didn't know people still had. And little by little, I stopped bracing for the worst. I started to believe that maybe love could feel different, not like control but like freedom. With David, love wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady, honest, and deeply kind. We built a life where I didn't have to walk on eggshells or hide parts of myself. We made dinner together, laughed at nothing, and talked about the future like it was something real. For the first time, the word family didn't feel heavy or painful. It felt like something I finally deserved. Sometimes in quiet moments I'd catch a flash of memory. A look Mark gave me, a word he twisted, a night I cried alone. But the sting had faded, replaced by something calmer, perspective. Those memories didn't control me anymore. They reminded me of how far I'd come. I didn't flinch at the past. I measured my strength by how well I carried it. And I carried it lightly now. I heard through someone that Mark had been seen at the same old bars, sitting alone, drinking until he couldn't speak. He had no job that stuck, no partner, no direction. The charm he once used like a weapon didn't work anymore. People saw through him now. He had become what he never expected, invisible. One night, months after the divorce, he sent me a message. Just one line. I made a mistake. I stared at it for a while, not with anger, but with a strange, quiet detachment. There was a time I would have cried reading that. Now I just deleted it and went back to my book. Some things don't need answers. Every time I laughed without fear or slept without tension, I felt like I reclaimed a piece of myself. Peace, I learned, wasn't silence, it was knowing I was safe, in control, and surrounded by real love. It was waking up next to someone who didn't lie. It was walking through life without bracing for pain. And every one of those moments was a win. Mark's business, the one he used to brag about, the one he thought made him untouchable, finally went under. Lawsuits, debts, burned bridges. He lost the office, the car, and eventually the apartment. All the power he once held crumbled beneath the weight of his own arrogance. No one fought for him. No one stayed. I saw him once on the subway, thin, unshaven, eyes downcast like he hadn't slept in days. I almost didn't recognize him. He saw me, froze, and quickly looked away, ashamed. I didn't stop, didn't speak, didn't even feel anger. Just a quiet sense of closure. That wasn't my life anymore. That subway ride stayed with me, not because of him, but because of how I felt after. I didn't feel haunted or shaken. I felt solid. Everything he tried to destroy in me had been rebuilt stronger. I had walked through fire and didn't burn, I became fire. And no one could take that away from me again. David and I started traveling, ticking off every destination I used to only dream about. Paris in the spring, Kyoto in autumn, the Greek islands in the summer, places Mark once promised but never took me to. I watched sunsets in silence, held hands in crowded streets, danced under foreign skies. And each moment reminded me, I hadn't just escaped a nightmare. I had stepped into a life I never thought possible. Back home, my job turned into a passion. I was promoted not because I fought for attention, but because I worked with heart and clarity. People respected my leadership, trusted my decisions. I became the woman I once looked for in others, confident, steady, unafraid. And every success reminded me I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. Rumors began to spread that Mark was living in a cheap motel outside the city, barely scraping by. No one visited, no one returned his calls, and those who once feared or respected him now barely remembered him. His name no longer held weight. It carried only whispers, embarrassment, and failure. He had become the cautionary tale he thought he was too clever to be. And the silence that surrounded him now was exactly what he'd once wished on me. I used my savings, wisely managed and fully mine, to buy a small house in New Jersey. The keys in my hand felt heavier than gold. They represented everything I had rebuilt from the ashes. No one's name was on the deed but mine. I painted the walls, planted flowers, and filled each room with warmth and honesty. It was the first home that truly belonged to me, body, heart, and soul. A year to the day after I boarded that cursed cruise, David handed me a small envelope at breakfast. Inside were tickets, not for escape, but for celebration. A trip to the Amalfi Coast, just the two of us, chosen not out of guilt but out of love. My hands trembled not with fear but with gratitude. This time the journey ahead was safe, and I was free to enjoy every second of it. Somewhere along that Italian coastline, I forgave myself. Not for trusting Mark, that wasn't the crime, but for staying too long after I stopped feeling loved. I let go of the shame, the what-ifs, the late-night doubts. I realized healing wasn't about forgetting, but about no longer blaming myself for someone else's cruelty. And with that release, I felt lighter than I had in years. When we returned home, I found a letter in my mailbox, a familiar handwriting, shaky and desperate. Mark had written a page of apologies, half-lies mixed with empty words like regret, forgiveness, second chance. I didn't even open it fully. I ripped it in half and dropped it in the trash without hesitation. He had already stolen enough of my time. He didn't deserve one more second of it. David and I raised our children with love, honesty, and an open heart. They grew up knowing what respect looked like, what real partnership meant. I told them my story when they were ready, not to scare them but to teach them strength. They didn't fear love because they saw how love should feel. And every time they hugged me, I knew I had broken the cycle. I had given them a better start than I ever had. Mark disappeared from everyone's radar. No friends, no family who answered. Even old colleagues avoided mentioning his name. It brought discomfort, shame, something unfinished. He had burned every bridge, and the world had quietly moved on without him. What he once feared most, being irrelevant, had finally become his only truth. Meanwhile, my home was filled with laughter, loud dinners, and spontaneous dancing in the kitchen. Holidays were warm, chaotic, and full of real affection. The kind that doesn't ask for perfection, only presence. We built our own traditions, made new memories that had nothing to do with pain. I never faked a smile again. Every laugh was earned, and every moment was mine to cherish. I found out, much later, that Mark spent Christmas alone most years, staring at a dusty old photo of us from when we were young and pretending. He'd sit in silence, no tree, no gifts, no calls. Just him and the weight of everything he had destroyed. No redemption arc, no final apology, no grand lesson learned, just loneliness. Exactly the ending he tried to write for me. I started giving talks at local women's groups, not because I saw myself as a hero, but because I knew how it felt to be stuck, silenced, and scared. I spoke about survival, about financial independence, about paying attention to the small signs before they become disasters. After every session, someone would come up with tears in their eyes, whispering, "You told my story." And in those moments I knew my pain had purpose. People began to whisper when his name came up, not with fear or admiration, but with quiet pity and judgment. "The man who tried to get rid of his wife," they said, shaking their heads like it was an urban legend. He was no longer respected, only remembered for what he lost and how far he had fallen. Even those who once admired him now used him as a warning. His shame lived louder than his voice ever did. I used to wonder why I had to go through all of it, the lies, the betrayal, the pain. But over time the answer became clear. I wasn't defined by the man who tried to break me, but by the woman I became afterward. The lesson wasn't about revenge, it was about rising. And in learning that, I finally felt peace where there used to be only rage. As the years passed, I met more women like me, strong, scarred, and rising from their own ruins. We formed bonds rooted in truth, not appearances. Dinners turned into therapy sessions, laughter into healing. None of us had perfect stories, but together we had hope. And that was more powerful than any past we carried. Word reached me that Mark had aged badly, not from time, but from bitterness and booze. He looked 20 years older, with gray skin and hollow eyes, hunched under the weight of choices he could never undo. His health was failing, but he refused help, too proud to admit he was crumbling. He had become a prisoner of his own ego, locked in a cell of regret. David and I renewed our vows in a quiet garden surrounded by friends, family, and the life we built together. There was no show, no spectacle, just honest words exchanged with tears and laughter. We didn't promise perfection, only presence. That day wasn't about erasing the past. It was about honoring the journey. And standing there, hand in hand, I knew I had found home. Mark tried one final act of desperation. He filed a lawsuit, claiming emotional damages and financial hardship. The court dismissed it without hesitation, labeling it what it was, a pathetic, baseless grab for attention. He walked out of that courtroom more humiliated than ever, barely able to look anyone in the eye. Even the judge seemed to pity him. It was his last attempt to matter, and it failed completely. Watching my children walk across their graduation stages, strong and proud, I felt something deeper than happiness. I felt fulfilled. They had grown up watching me rebuild, learning strength not from words, but from action. They didn't carry my wounds, only my wisdom. And in their eyes, I saw everything I had fought for finally take root. My legacy wasn't survival. It was resilience. Alone in a crumbling nursing home, Mark sat surrounded by peeling walls and forgotten days. No visitors. No laughter. Only the sound of a TV he no longer followed and the weight of memories he couldn't outrun. Staff said he mumbled names at night, reached out to no one, and stared at doors that never opened. He had spent his life chasing control and died with none. I, on the other hand, woke each day to sunlight through clean windows, coffee shared with David, and messages from my grown children. I traveled when I wanted, rested when I needed, loved freely and deeply. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, built on choices I made with open eyes. And every step forward felt like a victory against everything that once tried to hold me back. In the end, his life faded into shadows, whispered, forgotten, barely a footnote in anyone's story, while mine bloomed into brightness, filled with love, purpose, and the kind of peace that comes from facing the worst and choosing to rise anyway. He had tried to erase me. Instead, I outlived him, not just in years but in meaning. His ending was silence. Mine was a legacy. I stood in my garden one morning, coffee in hand, listening to the quiet sounds of birds and wind, and realized I had everything he once tried to steal from me: peace, joy, love, and freedom. He faded into regret, but I thrived in the light of every choice I made for myself. My story didn't end on that cruise, it was reborn there. And the ultimate victory wasn't revenge. It was living well, fully, fearlessly, and free. My daughter once asked me, "Mom, how did you survive all of it?" I paused, looked at her face, strong, determined, kind, and smiled. I survived by refusing to stay small, by choosing myself even when it hurt. My story became a blueprint for her, not of pain but of possibility. And in her strength, I saw the legacy I never thought I'd leave behind. David and I started a foundation to help women in crisis, women with nowhere to go and no one to trust. Every check we wrote, every safe room we built, felt like stitching something back together in the world. I wasn't just healing myself anymore. I was helping others find their own way out. That gave my past a new purpose. The pain had become power, transformed into something greater than revenge. Our home became a sanctuary, not just for us, but for friends, family, even strangers who needed rest. Music played in the background most days, kids ran through the halls, and love lived in every corner. No locked doors, no fear, no secrets. Just open arms and real connection. It was everything my first marriage wasn't, and exactly what I had always longed for. I stopped explaining myself to people who didn't ask with care. I wore what I liked, said what I meant, and walked into every room as a woman who had already survived her worst day. I didn't shrink anymore. I took up space in my life and in the world. And the woman I saw in the mirror was someone I finally deeply respected. Years later, I wrote everything down: the love, the betrayal, the storm, and the rise. It wasn't for revenge or fame, but so someone else could read it and feel less alone. The book reached thousands, then millions, and letters poured in from women saying, "You helped me leave." That was the day I knew I had turned my story into more than survival. I had turned it into light. I never spoke to Mark again after his lawsuit failed. I didn't need to. There was nothing left to say, no explanation that could fix what he tried to break. My closure didn't come from him, it came from how I rebuilt, how I kept walking forward. I didn't need his apology. I needed my own freedom, and I had it. I was no longer the woman who waited for permission to live. I was decisive, bold, and grounded in my truth. My past didn't make me bitter, it made me brave. I loved more carefully, more deeply, but never from fear. I had become the kind of woman who saved herself. We bought a cabin by a lake, a quiet escape where I could write, paint, breathe. It wasn't flashy, but it was filled with everything that mattered. We'd sit on the porch in silence, fingers intertwined, no words needed. Every inch of that life was something I built, not given, not stolen. And it felt like the softest, strongest kind of joy. There was no parade, no headline, no moment where the world clapped. Just small daily victories, a good night's sleep, a hand to hold, laughter that came easily. That was my triumph. Not loud but real. Not dramatic but unshakable. I had won the only battle that ever mattered. The one for myself.